Meet Reed Lance Rosenthal, rancher, #1 best-selling, award-winning author, and unabashedly, unapologetically on the right side of the outstanding issues of our generation. But don't try to fence him in. Sometimes his positions will surprise you, because Reed is definitely his own man, with his own opinions. You might love him, you might hate him, but you won't be able to stop listening. Step over to the right side with Reed.
Howdy, listeners and viewers, coast to coast, the Gulf to the 51st state. And I love that. And around the globe. Reed Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side Radio and the Cowboys Take. On all those video channels everywhere, Gab Truth, Brighteon, Pradeon, Rumble, YouTube, you name it. Remember, please, pass this link along if you like the show, or you know somebody who needs to have this information. Maybe they are on the verge of being awake. They're like nibbling on the red pill, but they haven't quite munched on it yet. And throw us a like, hit that bell so you know when these come out. And this is a continuation, this show, of the last show, just 3 days ago. And it's all about, should we say, the convergence of all sorts of things, astrological, Neptune and Aries, and one other huge astrological event that has not occurred for 400 years. It's about the fourth turning, 5 fourth turnings ago, 400 years ago. It's about the Kondratiev wave, which is an economic cycle that also coincides with 400 years ago. And several other, shall we say, momentous and irrefutable cycles, geopolitical, war, and economic, which all coincided at the same time 400 years ago. Not since, just 400 years ago. It's rather amazing. And I got a lot of comments on the show of 3 days ago. If you haven't listened to it, please do. I understand some of the sound went out, part of it. Sorry about that. We're on satellite out here. Every once in a while that's going to happen. My apologies. But people were absolutely struck by the similarities, even without the technology and without the communications and without the, advent of plane flights and space travel and all that kind of stuff of 400 years ago. The basic similarities in human nature, the basic similarities in the contest between sovereign states, the rise and fall of empires. It's really quite remarkable. And last week we went over the years 1590 to 1620. All of these cycles, whether it's a fourth turning, whether it's a Kondratiev wave, whether it's the change in generations where the baton, the torch is passed as the boomers are passing the torch to the Zers right now. All those things take time. They don't happen overnight. Oh yes, you can have a catastrophic event overnight, but the evolution of all these things takes time. And that is why I'm covering the 50 years, basically 1590 to 1640, slightly beyond that. We actually get into a few 1660s things in this, which are fascinating. Because that's how long it takes for all this to evolve. And our fourth turning, our intersection of astrology, whether you believe in it or not, our intersection with universal energies, the rinse and repeat cycle of humandom and earthlings, that goes on and on and on. It's gone on and on and on for a millennium. It will continue in the future. But we live in the now, and you need to understand, and one of your best teachers in understanding what is happening now and what the result could be, might be, is what has happened in the past. Anyway, I think you'll find this conclusion to this show, that intersection, that convergence of lines which occurs only 400 years, I think you'll find it fascinating. First, we're going to do a little bit of rat-a-tat-tat, bring you up to speed on some current events, not many. You probably know that Moody's downgraded the United States credit from AAA to AA1. Doesn't sound like much. It's huge, folks. It's huge. And it will have a detrimental effect on our trying to sell bonds and T-bills and finance our ridiculous profligate spending indefinitely into the future. It will also have an effect on interest rates, not beneficial. So we'll keep you posted on that. Moody's was the last credit rating agency to downgrade us. We got downgraded 4 years ago. Thank you, Obama, third term. We got downgraded 4 years ago, and this is the last credit agency standing on the AAA, and no more. So, 80 years ago, right? Fourth turning. 80 years ago, the Gen Zers of that time, they were called the Lost Generation. They were dispassionate like the Gen Zers are today. They were pragmatic like the Gen Zers are today. They were the, okay, I understand what the problem is, now let's handle it type of people. A lot more action, a lot less talk. And for one, I'm glad the Gen Zers will be, I hope sooner rather than later, coming into power in the Western world, but particularly in the United States over the coming decade or two. But 80 years ago, just put this in perspective, right? Another rinse and repeat. History rhymes. You know, it's the lesson is infallible, invaluable, irrefutable. 80 years ago, we signed this month the armistice, the surrender of Japan on the battleship Missouri. By the way, there was never a formal treaty, which is why we still have troops in Japan, why they, although this is changing now with China in the picture, why they haven't been allowed to have really an army or a navy. And Hitler committed suicide in Berlin. And we had VE Day, victory in Europe. In fact, Eisenhower, right, one of the lost generation, equivalent to the Zers of today, the Gen Zers of today, his cryptic message informing the President of the United States and Congress that we had won the war in Europe was the Allied mission in Europe has been accomplished. That was his entire communique. That kind of gives you an insight into the Gen Zer, and at that time, the lost generation mentality. The Supreme Court is hearing a bunch of really big cases. Some revolve around DOGE and the ability of the executive branch to curtail the agencies which are part of the executive branch. I mean, let me think about this for a moment. If you are the president or owner of a company, are you allowed to fire your employees? Let me think about this for a minute. And nationwide, the power of district judges to issue nationwide injunctions is also on the docket. You know, the left always goes too far. And Boksberg and his ilk, these judges are unbelievable. Almost all of them appointed by Obama. I mean, there are a few exceptions, but almost all of them by Obama. That's not a coincidence. They might have their power severely curtailed by the Supreme Court. Remember, I brought you the history of the district courts about 2 months ago. You can find it in the archives on therightsideradio.com. You should listen to it, because in the end, you know who has the power over the district courts? The United States Congress. And what are they doing? I don't know. What are they doing? Let's not even answer that. It will just piss us all off. And then we have birthright citizenship. That is now being played out in the Supreme Court. And by the way, very fascinating background on birthright citizenship. Do you know where that concept came from? It came from the Dred Scott case. You know, the case that all the Black Lives Matter and all those guys trying to distract you from what's real like to bring up and throw in the face of the white privileged people or whatever their current argument is. But the Dred Scott case was about the inalienable right to citizenship for anybody born in the United States. Yeah, it's part of the 14th Amendment. So the problem with Dred Scott and that case is that that was based on the parents being Americans, or at least one of the parents being Americans, to summarize a rather complex case. And that whole concept, whether or not as an illegal alien or a visa holder, you can come to the United States, drop a kid, and that kid is a citizen with all the benefits of U.S. citizenship and the ability to now bring you in, you know, because you're family, for kind of automatic amnesty and future citizenship. That is now in front of the Supreme Court. And then the Foreign Alien Enemies Act, where Trump has employed it. This goes back to the Boksburg judge, you know, I brought you that several shows ago. The Supreme Court kind of slapped him down on that temporarily. They said that he cannot use that act to deport illegal aliens, terrorists, the other scum that Obama third term allowed in here. However, they did schedule it for further oral argument to make a final ruling. Their ruling was just temporary. Be fascinating to see how that comes out. And then the ban on military or transgenders in the military. The Supreme Court upheld that ban, which was an executive order and issued also through the edicts of the Defense Department. So that was good. That was good. And then another one that the Supreme Court backed Trump on, although you didn't hear about it, but it's major, particularly when we're trying to get the budget together and DOJ is trying to, you know, like cut the fat, waste, fraud, and abuse, and there's trillions of it, okay? And that is the federal government now has some ability to control the collective bargaining power of federal employees' unions. I've told you about the federal employees' unions in previous shows. These unions are all powerful. Obviously, they exist for the people at the top, right? I mean, they take the dues, they put a little in their pocket, they pay their Democratic cronies, they get favors. This is all just cushy corruption of the highest degree, and unfortunately what we're uncovering at all levels of government. So that's a good thing. All right. A little economic news for you real quick. This is not good news. Household debt, that is United States household debt, was a whopping $14.3 trillion 5 years ago, right? COVID. Well, do you think it's gone down since the COVID conjure is over? Unfortunately, it has not. Household debt as of this month in the United States of America is $18.2 trillion. Up $4 trillion, give or take a few hundred billion amongst friends, over the last 5 years. That's not sustainable, folks, particularly when a significant chunk of that debt is carrying interest rates of 20 to 30% on credit cards and other types of credit facilities. I mean, think about it, okay? And in one really interesting tidbit, we're going to talk more about this in the coming weeks, the nuclear confrontation between India and Pakistan, the issuance of nuclear threats, and of course what's going on with Iran, and of course the threats of Russia over there in Ukraine, and the morons in Europe. This has gotten the airlines very worried. You know, not worried about like how many people will die, not worried about what kind of cities or might be destroyed or nuclear radiation or, you know, loss of agricultural productivity. No. They're worried about being able to continue to fly and charge for flight tickets. Yeah, of course. So they have met with all their top insurers. And they are right now hammering out a deal where the insurers, they'll have a protocol where in the event of a nuclear war, the insurers will say, you can fly here and you can fly there, but you can't fly there because it's glowing in the dark, so that the airlines can stay in business. I suppose that has some benefit, but I find the whole thing just remarkably macabre. You know, it's 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 certainly capitalism at play. How's that? Okay, now let's talk about 1621. Okay, 400 years ago, folks. The convergence of all sorts of waves, all sorts of cycles, all sorts of astrology and other mystical type energies, if you believe in those, they all coincide. And please do listen to my show 3 days ago. Once again, sorry for some of the garbled sound. 1609, actually 1621, in Prague, 26 noblemen are executed because they've rebelled against Ferdinand II. Remember, these fourth turnings are times of rebellion, they're times of invention, they're times of the passing of the baton, the torch of power from one generation to the other, the change in social mores, wars, the rise and fall of empires. I mean, it's all encompassing. In China, the Ming Emperor has given a eunuch, I told you about this last week, the power to decide basically who lives, dies, and can serve in the government. You know, maybe the first form of DEI, maybe, huh? Could be. Could be. And in 1636, France, a large Catholic country, but allied with the Dutch, of course, against Britain, and the poor Portuguese who are out there by themselves getting their butts kicked by the Dutch and the British, you know, the empire in decline. They entered the 30 Years' War. That's right. It's called 30 Years' War for a reason, as you'll see. In 1641, the British Navy, which is growing by leaps and bounds, the French Navy, which was strong at the time, and the Dutch Navy, which was basically taking over the hegemon position from Portugal, are kicking butt, not only on the Portuguese, but on several other kind of nation states, including Venice, who's been ravaged by disease. I don't know if you know that Venice, believe it or not, was a nation state and one of the most powerful countries in the world at that time. And within 10 to 20 years, it basically ceased to be a power at all. I mean, zippo, zero, nada, nothing. The Portuguese would soon follow it. And the Portuguese are having difficulty defending their overstretched trade routes and fortresses around the world. Wow, does this sound familiar? And there was a big battle with the Dutch in January 1641 along the eastern shoreline of the Malay Peninsula. The Dutch defeated the Portuguese. They took control of Malacca, basically, you know, a significant portion of the East. In 1641 also, 21 Dutch ships appear off the coast of Angola, another long-held Portuguese territory. The Dutch capture Luanda and Benguela, and the Portuguese have to retreat inland. In other words, they're losing. The Dutch are attacking all their shipping points, all their trading points, right? All wars are economic, folks. All wars are economic. Also in 1641, there's an Anglican bishop, John Atherton, who just before he gets hanged, confesses that his crime of buggery, and you can look that up, I won't give you the graphic description here on air, was indeed his. By the way, Guess who was the biggest proponent of hanging people accused of admitting to or convicted of buggery? Oh, yes, Mr. Atherton. You bet. In 1642, you'll find this fascinating. King Charles I, he's king of England, Scotland, and Ireland. He's the son of King James, by the way. He'd been ruling since 1625, but the Protestants and the Puritans didn't like the fact that he leaned toward Catholicism, right? Religion. Just like you see right now. Hindu versus Muslim. Muslim versus Jew. It's fascinating, fascinating. And he's in conflict with his non-Catholic subjects. And civil war has erupted. On one side, you have the king and his armies, and on the other side, believe it or not, you have Parliament, the British Parliament, and its armies. So, little thought on that in terms of, shall we say, the divisions in countries, certain countries around the world right now. I'll tell you how that turned out in just a moment. In Iran, Abbas II becomes the seventh Shah, and he renews friendly contacts with Europe, okay, which had the rulers before him had been kind of distancing themselves from the Anglos, from the Christians, if you will. But there is a very strong Muslim clergy. Does this sound familiar? That's right. This is not today. This is 400 years ago. And the clergy believes that the Shahs have to go. That, in fact, the Shahs are so bad that they're God's punishment for allowing an infidel into a position of power. An infidel, by the way, who consorts with the other infidels, those pesky Europeans. And when he's kind of booted, the ulama, they're kind of the forerunners to the ayatollahs, they institute and they believe strongly that a temporal authority, the ability to govern, decide everything, right? The supreme ruler concept, should belong to the mujahid, a scholar of Muslim and the Quran, also predating the current ayatollahs. It's amazing how all this kind of plays out over the centuries, doesn't it? Over the millennium, in fact, in some cases. The Dutch painter Rembrandt, because remember, these periods are periods of great art, great expression, great change. The Dutch painter Rembrandt paints the rabbi. India is corrupt. The ruler there, the Mughal emperor, Jahan was his name, Jahan. He squanders the capital's wealth by building all sorts of palaces and trinkets and stuff for his many wives. In fact, the Taj Mahal was built by him for one of his wives. How's that for use of your tax money? Rebels overthrow the Ming emperor in China. He hangs himself, by the way, and a Manchu army, the rebels, they take power in the capital city of Beijing. Wow. And here we are again, 400 years later, folks. Ming supporters flee. Where do you think the Ming supporters flee to after they're defeated by the Manchus? Taiwan. That's right, 400 years ago. Here we are again, folks. It's unbelievable. It really is. Oh, yeah. Low solar activity begins at about 1645. It's called the Maunder Minimum, and ice spreads across the globe. I mean, you can't get to Greenland. It's totally iced in. Okay, so much for Trump's plans. It's totally iced in. The Arctic is closed to any and all shipping, not that it was enjoying much shipping in those days anyway. There weren't such things as quote-unquote icebreakers. And even the canals, right, in Holland were frozen solid a significant portion of the year. By the way, it did not help the decline of Venice either. And this lasts all the way to 1715. And in fact, had much to do with how many people died of starvation and disease. It was the tail end of the plagues. But it was a natural disaster, and it was natural. This was not global warming. This was not climate change. This is none of that nonsense. Okay? Because this has been going on since the earth was born, actually. And I'll just point to you the plans, the enunciated plans of George Soros and our Microsoft buddy, Bill Gates, who want to launch planes and put out various silver and other iodide crystals to reflect sunlight from the earth. You think they've studied history? I think they have, since both of them are firm proponents of getting the population down to a manageable 1 billion from its current quote-unquote unmanageable 8.5 billion. Okay. The French establish an outpost. They're trying to be an up-and-coming empire here. Of course, they never quite make it. And they establish an outpost at the mouth of Africa's Senegal River. And they trade for gum and for what? Slaves. Yes. You know, all the righteous Europeans. Slavers long before the Southerners were, folks. Long before. And there's an uprising against the Portuguese also in Africa. And who do the natives? Queen Nzinga, who was the leader of the rebel armies. Who do they side with? Oh, the Dutch. It's called a proxy war. Where have we heard that term before? Wow. And it's now 1648. All the European powers that had been fighting the 30 Years' War have clobbered each other, and they're exhausted. Germany lost a third of its population in that war. A third of its population. And there's a negotiated peace. It's called the Peace of Westphalia, which is negotiated. Except that France and Spain decide to continue their fight for another 10 years. You know, it's the Spanish and the French. And with the Peace of Westphalia, the 80 Years' War between Spain's Habsburg family, very powerful family in Europe, kind of the remnants of the Spanish Empire, which succeeded, which then morphed into the Portuguese Empire, which then morphed into the Dutch Empire, which then morphed into the British Empire, all during this time period, 400 years ago, the rise and fall of empires. People in Moscow in 1648, they revolt when salt is taxed by the rulers there. And Cossacks invade Poland, killing 200,000 Jews. You know, the anti-Semitism we talked about in the last show, 400 years ago, manifesting itself again. In Britain, King Charles has been defeated by Parliament. And he is beheaded, of course. The guillotine, the instrument of love back in those days. And England is now a republic, kind of, but a commonwealth without a House of Lords. And it's run by the victors, as often happens in the Civil War. And they appoint, Parliament, the victors, appoints Puritan Oliver Cromwell. Remember that name? A tough and vicious man. And they send him to Ireland to subdue the Catholics. Well, here we're back again to the religious thing. He massacres the populations of 2 entire towns to make a point. Cromwell defeats all the Scottish armies. There's a book called Leviathan. It's by the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes. Remember, during these periods, there's great advancement, enlightenment, etc. He dislikes democracy intentionally. He doesn't like the passions of the mob. He favors a commonwealth, a social contract, a commonality, a community between people who designate their powers to a central authority and submit to that authority. That is one of the parts of the turnings. That's the second turning, or the first turning, excuse me. We're now moving from the fourth into the first turning here as I wrap this up for you. The Dutch East India Company. By the way, the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company, these two huge at that time companies that dominated basically all commerce in the world, one backed obviously by the English and one backed by the Dutch, as the English sought to displace the Dutch as the hegemons of the planet. Who do they remind you of? BlackRock? Vanguard? Kind of. In fact, more than kind of. Huh. Yep. The more things change, the more they stay the same, folks. The more they stay the same. And the Dutch East India Company establishes a toehold in southern Africa. Okay? This is where the term Afrikaners came from. This is South Africa. And it was the Dutch and then finally the English that developed that country and are now getting executed and their lands taken by a somewhat zealous, quote-unquote, African parliament down there. And then finally, folks, to wrap this up, near Cape Town, this is the beginnings of the conflicts you see now, 400 years later, the next series of turnings, the next convergence of all these lines. Dutch farmers are taking over tribal grazing lands, or so the tribes think. The tribes attack the Dutch, and the Dutch successfully defend themselves. And in 1660, right, we come full circle now, full circle. Back to the second turning, right? The first, the second, the third, and the fourth, which we're just leaving. The second turning, England's Parliament restores the monarchy to the eldest son of Charles I, Charles II. And here we are, all ready to rock and roll again, folks. Rock and roll again. It's quite amazing. I love this kind of history. I really do. As a couple of other little tidbits in the few years following where I'm leaving off here, Charles, the King of England, marries a Portuguese princess and acquires Tangiers in North Africa and Bombay on the west coast of India. Allah, the British Empire has its footholds in Tangiers and in India. And we know how all that turned out, don't we? And the final, kind of the last war of the English and the Dutch have begun, and English soldiers seized the town of New Amsterdam. Oh, New Amsterdam? So you shrug your shoulders like, who cares? That's far away. Well, no, it isn't. Because they renamed New Amsterdam the city of New York. That's right, New York City. And they name it after the king's brother, the Duke of York. So there you go. This is Reed Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side Radio and the Cowboys Take. Thanks so much for listening. I really appreciate all you folks. I hope you enjoy these shows. And I hope that you enjoy me bringing them to you. And I want you to think about the stuff we've been talking about here, okay? I want you to really give it some thought. I want you to think about how it plays into today's history, which we're living history right now, and what effect it's going to have on your freedoms, your property, your finances, your family, and act accordingly. Take the necessary steps. You keep the wind at your back. We'll talk to you in the next few days. I'm going to bring you up to speed even more on the real estate stuff that I started, 2-3 shows ago, and bring you up to speed on what's happening in the real estate markets around the United States, because they've changed even in the 2 weeks since I did those shows. And although there are exceptions, most of the changes are not for the better. Keep the wind at your back.